Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
I'm Samuel Minev Benzecry. I'm a junior studying Earth Systems and Linguistics.
And we have with us here Professor Marshall Burke and Professor Sol Hsiang, both from the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. You just ran a super interesting conference entitled Preparing for a Changing Climate. What's the background on this?
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here. And I really want to thank you and folks at the GSB for helping us put on this conference to start. It was, we're really lucky to be able to do it over here. So the background, we all know climate change is a problem. When people think about climate solutions, they tend to think about climate mitigation. So how do we stop climate change itself? How do we reduce and eliminate emissions of human-caused greenhouse gases and thus slow climate change? And that is indeed super important, right? We want to lessen the amount of global warming and climate change that we're going to get. But the best science tells us that we're going to make progress at that, and we have made progress, but we're likely to get between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of warming over the next century. And that is a lot of warming. What we've seen in recent data, and all you have to do is look around the world to see that we are unprepared for the climate change that we've already seen, which is about 1 degree Celsius warming, and thus certainly super unprepared for the warming that we have in the pipeline. And so how we deal with that warming, we generally call adaptation. And so this conference was really about adaptation and trying to cast a wide net for researchers around the world studying adaptation and really figuring out what works to help prepare us for this changing climate, help protect human society from a climate that's going to rapidly change.
That is so important. You know, Sam, the changes that Marshall describes are changes that are going to unfold over your lifetime. How did you react to what you heard at the conference?
For me, it was very fascinating. I was only in the credit markets and housing markets talks, and it was a huge surprise to see people that were not as involved with climate in the past, or not necessarily environmental scientists, talking about these issues and how it's affecting finance, housing markets, and fields alike. So for me, it was fascinating because I feel like while I'm in my undergrad, I'm only talking to people that are involved with the sciencey side of things and of research. So seeing people in finance, in business in general, just discussing these things from an academic standpoint was fascinating.
Oh, that's interesting. And Sol, when you look at the wide variety of papers that you guys brought forward, what was most surprising to you?
I think there were a couple papers where either there were effects of the climate or there were ways in which people were adapting that were just much like the magnitudes of the effects that people were finding in their data were stunning. So, for example, there's one paper looking at the small business loans that come from the federal government after natural disasters. And they were finding that these loans have an ROI that's like 40 or something. It was like incredible. It was like the government does a little bit to help people recover after disaster, and then they just take off. And that's almost like a pilot program within the government. And I think an analysis like this, the federal government doesn't actually realize how effective they are. So this type of analysis has the potential to dramatically, to support dramatic scaling of those types of adaptation policies.
Oh, so when you say an ROI, maybe you could flesh that out for our listeners.
Sorry. So
that's okay.
So that's like the idea is like the government goes in, businesses are trying to rebuild in the wake of a disaster. They're struggling to get a loan because maybe they don't even appear as creditworthy right after the disaster because the prospects for their business don't look great. So the federal government comes in, gives people short-term loans that help them get back on their feet and rebuild. And then what this analysis showed was those loans have a really large effect on the survival of these businesses. The businesses that don't get the loans are much more likely to go under in the next year or two. And then on top of that, like getting these loans increases the chance that you will also get other private sector loans. So there's this kind of piling on where the government plays a little role to sort of nudge the market in the right direction. and then it just kind of carries on its own. So I think that's really a powerful message.
Oh, very interesting.
I was really interested in the credit one, especially that one paper that was mentioned about the Philippines and gender-based loans, which was really fascinating because my background is mostly in Brazil, in the Amazon region, and thinking about current crisis affecting there and how credit can be relevant for climate mitigation was fascinating too.
To give a little color on the Philippines paper, this was an experiment that some researchers ran with NGO giving out loans and basically was trying to evaluate whether access to credit in the wake of a disaster was helpful in disaster recovery. So Sol mentioned in the small business loan case in the U.S., researchers found really beneficial effects of access to, in this case, government-supplied credit. In the Philippines, somewhat surprisingly, they found that they did not find a big effect of these, or so far are not finding a big effect of these loans, and are certainly trying to understand why. So this is the one sort of null result we had in the conference. Publishing null results is really important, but in this case, it was a bit of a surprise given that the other paper found such large effects.
There must be some speculation about the null effect. I realize a null effect is not a finding, but still, what would your speculation be?
They actually talked about it in the paper. So the idea was that the government opened up access to these loans, but there were loan officers who basically provide financial advice to the women who are in this microloan organization. And what they were finding is that the loans were not actually being taken out by the women. And they thought that it was because the loan officers were essentially discouraging folks from taking on more debt. And so the idea is that, just having a program by the government is not enough. You have to sort of educate everyone down the line in terms of what the implementation goals look like and what's feasible. So this was a case in which, it looked like the loan officers had these families, interests probably at heart. It wasn't like a malicious thing. It's like, maybe you don't need so much debt, like that could be risky. So there's a balance here. We're trying to figure out these different instruments, how they're deployed and how they will be received, because not only is the context of climate change new, and the idea of adapting to it new, but then all these ways we're experimenting with adaptations, these are new and unfamiliar to people as well.
That's very interesting. Sometimes I hear the expression capacity building talked about when you think about the context and its ability to take on some of the policies that might work in one area. This might be an interesting example where some capacity building might help these policies work in the future.
Absolutely.
During the conference, we had numerous papers on the importance of information and how information can improve how well markets function after a natural disaster in the context of climate change. That's really important in the GSB context, right? GSB is convinced of the importance of markets, as are we. A lot of these papers, again, showed that you need people to be well informed. So one interesting paper showed that buyers need better information about flood risk. And if they give that information, if the market then can send the right signal, right? They houses that are that they know are more exposed to flood risk, they are sold at a discount, as they should be, right? There's a danger baked into buying that house. In another setting in India, a very different setting, we found that when farmers are given better seasonal forecasts of what the weather is going to be during the growing season, they can change their behavior in ways that are really profitable and lead to much better household level and farm level outcomes. So again, multiple papers pointing to the importance of information in responding to a changing climate.
Do you want to jump in and tell the story of the flood risk paper? Because those two real estate papers were just both astounding experiments to be evaluated.
Go for it. Yeah, the Redfin one.
Yeah, people probably have seen this in their everyday life, but basically Redfin and a bunch of other real estate sort of websites are rolling out risk assessments of every property that you look at when you're surfing around looking for houses. So this is a transformation of this market. It's like a flooding, no pun intended, flooding the market with a whole bunch of new information no one has ever seen before. No one had any idea what was going to happen when this information was released. And so it was, really amazing that there was one team that was well positioned to basically do sort of an experimental rollout of it, when in some places people didn't actually see this information and other people did. And they looked at how it changed their behavior in terms of which houses they were looking at. And so houses that were in higher risk areas definitely were attracting less attention, and people were looking at them less, and presumably that's going to lead to them having a discount in their ultimate sale price. The other amazing experiment was the protection of the city of Venice. So this is like one of the most famous engineering efforts. Venice has been sort of slowly sinking while the oceans are coming up. And so almost a decade ago, there was a team of engineers who came up with this design to basically shut off the mouth of the lagoon that the city is part of, so that when there's a big tide coming in, they can like float up these giant pontoons that then block the ocean, and then the entire lagoon is like several feet lower than the ocean level, and that like protects the city. And so what this study was doing was showing that like basically all the ground floor apartments that are for rent in Venice, as soon as they like turn on the machine that blocks the ocean, the next storm that came through didn't flood these basement units. And then very quickly, the price of those units and their rental rates, like, went up exactly like you would predict.
That's interesting. I'd like to push both of you, Sol and Marshall, on something here to help out our listeners, because from an economic perspective, there's great meaning to having the markets reflect the true value, including the implications of flooding or possible not flooding, right? And that's a much longer term dynamic. And I'd love you to explain that to our listeners.
Basically, when markets capture the true value of assets, including like the effects of the environment on the people who own them, then we think that people will, people purchasing a piece of land or some other type of asset will understand and value the benefits that accrue to them or the harms that are generated and hurt them. Like Marshall was saying, like when people don't have good information, then the market's not going to internalize these ideas. People are going to be trading stuff. They don't realize that it's like maybe they have a lemon house that's going to flood, in a couple years, and they just have no idea. So what these studies are showing is that the markets, when people have information or when the infrastructure is there to protect them, the markets do reflect these facts. Like the markets are not just sort of like a wild west in which people are doing things in an uninformed way. There's a lot of information in the market, and it can really help get the right resources to the right communities. That said, there's limits to what markets can do. And that's, I think, another outcome of this, conference is cases where there's like externalities. Is what we talk about are things where people are generating effects on others, and they like, so the Mumbai study, I think, was like a really good example where they were basically finding when it rains really hard, there's a lot of flooding in the city, and basically like human waste goes everywhere. Children get sick, and there's much higher mortality from basically like localized flooding in the city than I think anyone expected. Everyone's jaw hit the floor when we saw those numbers.
I mean, those are very different cases, very different places too. And I wonder more generally what both of you think about possibilities of conflicts of interest, let's say, in those different contexts. Like say in the US, for example, in coastal US, if it's of interest of house sellers announcing, for example, the discounts for the risk for the properties in risk. I wonder because in the case of Venice, it seems more it seems to be a thing that's more plausible, that's more tactile even in a way, because the city has a history of flooding. But in the case of, like, say, Florida, for example, where you only have it in some extreme events, I wonder how that will play out in considering the interests of real estate developers and sellers and just the housing market in general.
Yeah, this is a really important point. And so we have some research on this with a former grad student here, now faculty, Mika Hino. We looked at differences across states where in some states they mandate disclosure. So the seller has to tell the buyer this house might flood sometimes. And in other states, you don't have to tell anything, right? And in the states where disclosure is mandated, buyers are much better informed, as you would expect, right? And so I think you are, again, pointing to an important facet of information in these markets. We need to force markets in some settings to reveal the relevant climate risk information, right? So Redfin's going to do that now, and other real estate agencies are going to do that. But still, we need to make sure that buyers have that information. And so I think there is a role, again, for government intervention to make sure that that information is flowing correctly through these markets.
I wonder what other implications it also has, because, we have models of, places where, not quite in the US, but that might have some extreme heat waves, or, but also in the US, extreme heat waves and other extreme climate events as such. And I wonder what are some ways that the market is reacting to these things, these long-term predictions 20, 30 years from now, because housing is a long-term, operates in the long term. So I wonder if you have any insider information on how the market is slowly reacting to these long-term predictions of extreme climate events. And
so that's a great question. There was one paper that was pretty interesting, a little provocative, which Harrison Hong came and presented this sort of paper looking at macroeconomic effects of extreme events, and it was trying to describe sort of why we see the patterns in the market that we see. And it really looks like basically like when a sequence of bad events occur, people seem to start to believe that, oh, maybe climate change is real and like things are different, and they it appears in the data that they're behaving in a way that looks like they're adapting a bit more. But then when you have a period that's like a long lull with like not a lot of hurricanes hitting like a location, for example, it's almost like people start to get optimistic and thinking like, oh, maybe like climate change isn't real. And then they look like they're starting to unadapt. And so what you're seeing in the data is like people are aware of these long-term forecasts, but the extent to which they sort of like buy into them and like invest in protecting themselves against them is sort of interacting with their own personal experience. If they don't see it happening on the ground, it's very hard probably to keep them motivated to protecting themselves. And I think that's part of like the challenge here is that, like given the nature of a lot of these extreme events, not everyone's going to experience them all the time. And so you do need people, things like earthquake insurance. I mean, that's not climate change, but building codes are there to protect people, because otherwise people get a little lax, and then we know that when something happens. So I think that's part of the challenge, and some of the studies were showing that.
An interesting thing we've seen in the U.S., and I think an important point here, is that people are not just optimizing for climate. They care about other things as well. So if you look at population movement in the U.S., people are moving to places that our maps would say are going to be more climate exposed. So you see more people going to the Sun Belt, like lots of people moving to Phoenix, Arizona, lots of people moving to Florida. Two hot spots for climate change impacts. It's going to get hot and you're going to get more intense hurricanes. Why are people moving there? Well, those are nice places to live, right? It's pretty pleasant in Phoenix most of the year. It's pretty nice in Florida. And so, people are trading off these risks. We need to make sure they are well informed about those trade-offs. That's sort of an important thing we can do.
Interesting. What do you think are some ways of informing them?
So some of the experiments we talked about and that we had nice papers on. So making sure that when people are, say, purchasing a property, they are informed about the potential climate risks that property is going to be exposed to. So that's step one. I think often people underestimate the influence of climate on other outcomes in their life. So they don't realize how important it is for their own well-being. Sol just had a great paper a couple weeks ago in Nature showing the impact of hurricanes on mortality, and the impacts last for years and years after a big storm. We've done work on extreme heat impacts on mortality. Similarly, you see really large effects that persist for a long time. I think we could do a better job, honestly, of informing people about the magnitude of those risks. So again, people can make the choices that make sense for them.
As you said, people do have other priorities that they consider when they're moving to a place, and climate is often not on top. Actually, something interesting that happened in in Brazil recently was that there was some big news agency that showed a report that people in the Amazon region were not too worried about the environment as they were about health, education, and safety. And once you put it in a big context, in a global context, like what place is not worrying about those things? So at the same time, those other aspects come in the table when, those considerations are being made. I wonder like how a future where people worrying about the climate will look like.
Yeah, like, so as you talk about that, like there was one paper that kind of, I think, paints that picture in an interesting context. So Kyle Meng came and presented this paper about day zero in Cape Town, which was basically Cape Town was running out of water after having a prolonged drought. The reservoirs were getting really low, and they were trying to get everyone to conserve water, like really extreme levels of conservation, like cutting back their water use by like 90% in some areas. And what was interesting is that they did see that actually day zero was supposed to be the day that they ran out of water. It never arrived because there was enough conservation, and then the rains came. But what they ended up seeing was that they were able to reduce water use because like all the rich households in Cape Town were basically drilling wells in their backyard. And that's ended up being this whole transformation where instead of relying on the sort of public utility, everyone started pumping water out of their backyard. And then when the rains came back, those households just kept relying on their backyard water instead of like the public utility. And so that's kind of paints an interesting picture of the future where you're like, oh, some people are really just going to have enough resources to like build new types of infrastructure that they rely on. And that's like a fundamental change in how these communities are organized and use their resources. So a world in which, the middle and low income groups are like using public water sources, and all the wealthy folks are, have like these privatized water sources that they can, protect and monopolize. There's other cases where people are really, there's a little bit of a mystery why they're not protecting themselves. So for example, Judd Boomhauer from San Diego came and he was showing this study where they were basically like paying households to like cut down the bushes around the house and protect themselves from wildfire. And they got like reasonable take up, but it wasn't what they expected, where it was like a lot harder to convince houses to actually just do some very basic measures that would protect them from, higher wildfire risks. And so those are cases where I think we need to do some more innovation to figure out like, why is it that people are not, and maybe it's they're busy, like they got a lot of stuff going on. They have kids that are sick, like I did today. And it's just hard to like, mow the grass, I guess.
So any final thoughts or main takeaways from the conference?
Big takeaway for me is really excitement about the amount of really high quality empirical work in this area. One of our goals with this conference is to build a community of researchers who are working on these sort of topics and crowd in folks who, like you said at the beginning, didn't originally work on climate or might not have been interested in climate, but realize it's important for the economic outcome or setting that they think about a lot. And so if conferences like this can spur new research by folks who don't normally work on that, then that would be a huge success. So we hope to, again, do these more going forward.
Yeah, I agree. It was like just very inspiring to see people from all the different fields of economics research coming together and trying to solve this problem, kind of like applying tools from macro and micro and public finance and a variety of other tools. Super interesting. And it's, we did this last year, and I think this year was like a whole step up in terms of quality. And so I just can't wait to see what happens next year.
Okay, well, that's super interesting. Well, look, Sam, Sol, Marshall, thank you so much. And to you listeners, until next time, the Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.